Blood has three main functions: transport, homeostasis, and protection. Blood helps us to transport gases such as carbon dioxide and oxygen, nutrients such as glucose, amino acids, fatty acids and glycerol, and nucleotides, wastes such as uric acid and urea, ions such as sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, hormones, etc. Blood also helps us to maintain homeostasis. We already learned how blood helps to maintain temperature balance. It also maintains water balance, acid-base balance, and salt balance. The other main function of blood is protection. Through the function of white blood cells, blood helps us to fight off infections. So it provides immunity, long-term immunity against infectious agents. Let's take a quick look at blood composition. If we were to draw blood and place it in a test tube and centrifuge the test tube, blood will separate into three layers. The bottom layer that you see in red here are packed with red blood cells. The next layer, which is the buffy layer, is made up of white blood cells and platelets. The top transparent liquid layer is made up of plasma. The white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells together make up what we called formed elements. Formed elements largely determine the viscosity or thickness of blood. The plasma, on the other hand, determines the osmolarity of blood. Plasma proteins, glucose, and salts in blood, they determine the osmolarity of blood. Let's take a closer look at these two blood properties, viscosity and osmolarity, and we will see how, when either one of them is too high or too low, they result in health consequences. Here's viscosity, which is the thickness of blood, and this is osmolarity, which has to do with solute concentration in the plasma. So, when viscosity is too high, it increases blood pressure, and that places an enormous burden on the heart, and so it results in heart problems. If the viscosity is too low, then the blood is too thin and it ends up with too much bleeding, excessive and unnecessary bleeding. Osmolarity. If the osmolarity is too high, water enters blood vessels and so blood volume and blood pressure go up. So osmolarity, increased osmolarity, leads to high blood pressure. If it's too low, it ends up with edema. A child who is a victim of starvation ends up with a swollen belly, which is really edema. So we're going to take a look at how starvation ends up in edema. So here we have a child that is starving, and as a result, the dietary intake of protein is very low because during times of famine, it is very hard to get protein. So when the dietary intake of protein is low, then plasma protein production goes down because there are not enough protein raw materials to make plasma proteins. When the plasma protein production goes down, plasma protein levels in blood go down. We've just learned that plasma protein levels have something to do with osmolarity. So blood osmolarity also goes down. When blood osmolarity goes down, reabsorption in the capillary also goes down. So when that happens, more fluid leaves the capillary than enters. So fluid leaves blood vessels. And this ends up with an accumulation of fluid, and we call this edema. Let's take a look at another example. Alcoholism, as we all know, can lead to liver damage, and liver damage can lead to edema. So let's see how that happens. Normally, the liver makes plasma proteins. The liver is like a factory. It makes majority of the proteins that end up in the plasma. So alcoholism causes liver damage, and as a result, plasma protein production goes down. And therefore, plasma protein levels go down. We've just learned that plasma protein levels have a lot to do with blood osmolarity. So blood osmolarity goes down. When that happens, reabsorption in the capillary also goes down, decreases. When reabsorption decreases, more fluid leaves blood vessels. Where do they end up? In the tissue. And an accumulation of fluid in the tissue is called edema. Let's take a look at a different example. It's the opposite of what we just saw, and that is how diabetes ends up with high blood pressure. So a person with diabetes can end up with high blood pressure. We all know that diabetes is characterized by high blood sugar. So when the blood sugar levels go up, they influence blood osmolarity. So blood osmolarity also increases. When blood osmolarity increases, more fluid is drawn into the capillary, so reabsorption increases and fluid enters blood vessels. When this happens, the blood volume increases. And we all know that when blood volume increases, blood pressure increases as well. So that's how a person with diabetes can end up with high blood pressure. Let's learn some terminology before we move forward and learn about blood cell formation. Here's a new word, erythropoiesis. Erythro means red, and poiesis means formation or creation. So erythropoiesis is the formation of red blood cells. Here's another word, erythropoietin. We know that erythro means red, poiesis means formation, but the suffix "n" means protein. So erythropoietin is a protein that helps in the formation of red blood cells. Hemopoiesis. Hemo means blood. Hemopoiesis is the formation of all blood cells. So it's a more general term. Erythropoiesis is just red blood cell formation. Hypoxemia. Hypo, as you know, means low. Oxy, what does that sound like? Oxygen. Emia means blood condition. So a blood condition in which there is less oxygen, or in other words, there is less oxygen in the blood. How is the rate of erythropoiesis regulated? Or how does the body know when to make red blood cells? The body knows when there is hypoxemia. When you run out of oxygen, the levels of oxygen in blood go down, and this is sensed by the liver and the kidneys. They are activated to produce a hormone called EPO or erythropoietin. This is the protein that increases the rate of erythropoiesis. This must happen in the bone marrow. So EPO acts on the bone marrow, which becomes activated, and so the rate of erythropoiesis goes up. As a result, the number of red blood cells increases. As we know, red blood cells carry oxygen, and This brings the level of oxygen in blood back to normal. This is a negative feedback loop, starting with low oxygen and ending with increased levels of oxygen. Let's take the example of emphysema. People with emphysema often die of heart failure. This has something to do with the rate of erythropoiesis that we just looked at. People with emphysema have chronic hypoxemia because their lungs are damaged. Even when the level of RBCs go up, the levels of oxygen still remain low. So let's see how this can impact the heart. So hypoxemia activates the liver and the kidneys, which sense this and release EPO. EPO acts on the bone marrow, which becomes activated. As a result, the rate of erythropoiesis increases, resulting in the increase in red blood cells. Normally, we would expect the blood levels of oxygen to go up. However, due to the chronic hypoxemia that persists in emphysema patients, the levels of oxygen remain low. So this cycle keeps on repeating. As a result, the blood viscosity increases to dangerous levels. When blood viscosity increases, peripheral resistance also increases, and that increases blood pressure to a degree that it places an enormous burden on the heart, finally resulting in congestive heart failure. Here is the process of erythropoiesis. We see 5 cells here. The cell on the left-hand side is called the stem cell. It's the cell that differentiates into the red blood cell at the right-hand corner. Notice how the cell has changed from the stem cell to the RBC. So let's look at the major changes. For one thing, the RBC is much smaller than the stem cell. You may not be able to see this in this picture, but it is actually flat like a frisbee compared to the very round stem cell. It is red in color and it has also lost its nucleus. So let's look at some of the benefits of these changes based on the functions of the RBC. The red blood cells must travel through very small capillaries, so a small size helps it to fit into the smallest capillaries so it can deliver blood to all your tissues. A frisbee moves much faster than a ball, so the flat shape allows the red blood cell to move very fast through the bloodstream. The red color is attributed to the presence of hemoglobin. A single RBC holds about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So that's a lot of hemoglobin, and that's what makes it red. Now, hemoglobin is a fairly large molecule, so 250 million of them must take up a lot of space. So to make room for the hemoglobin, the RBC loses its nucleus.